Well, it looks like the city of San Francisco has a lawsuit on their hands. The National Rifle Association is apparently not happy with them. They feel like they have some grounds to sue after the city of San Francisco, their city council there, declared the NRA a domestic terrorist organization. Now, this is a part of a series of events to where, people on the right and the left are calling, groups associated with either side domestic terror organizations, which, is to be expected now that the culture war is heating up and, people are inching towards a civil war, which I don't think is imminent. I'm not quite as bearish on the U.S.'s short-term future as, say, Tim Pool is. I don't think that we're going to have a complete breakdown in the political order yet. But with that said, it is fitting, if you're inching towards in that direction, that each side would not regard their opinions as legitimate, but rather they would regard them as sort of enemies of the state, whatever state they happen to adhere to, whatever ideal of what the state should be. And so on the right, they've declared that Antifa is a domestic terrorist organization. That's become a very common slogan. And I wouldn't dispute that necessarily. I think they certainly do act in pretty terrorizing ways when they respond to people who go out and have their little rallies in Portland or whatever. But that is a group associated with the left that the right considers to be domestic terrorists. Now, on the left, they consider a group associated with the right to be domestic terrorists, and that is the National Rifle Association. So this is sort of a way that people are trading blows back and forth by labeling each other domestic terrorists and essentially saying that your opinion's no longer valid. You're so far outside of our Overton window that your opinion is actually a threat to society. And San Francisco says as much in their resolution. They say that the NRA are terrorists not because, they have committed any acts of violence themselves, but because they're downplaying how dangerous guns are. And they're essentially advocating violence by saying that people should have guns because guns themselves are inherently violent. That's kind of the point that the city council was trying to make. Which, of course, is a load of nonsense, and I imagine that's why the NRA feels like they have a pretty good case to sue the city of San Francisco. They claim that San Francisco's resolution violates the First Amendment because essentially, by labeling the NRA domestic terrorists, the city is probably not going to deal too favorably when it comes to people who are members of the NRA. They probably will be denied jobs with the city. Simple things, clerical matters like that. They're going to make your life difficult if you're a member of the NRA. Of course, the last gun store in San Francisco finally closed not too long ago. They were driven out of business, so I'm not sure how many NRA members live in San Francisco. It would be a little tough. They've already pretty much pushed you out of the city. It's very clear that you're kind or not welcome there. But nonetheless, the NRA does feel that with this act, they've crossed a line into violating freedom of speech because they're essentially going to be choosing not to hire certain citizens based on their political opinions. And I think based on the way that the First Amendment is interpreted and applied in the modern age, the NRA certainly does have a case. Of course, I personally, if I were the judge, I would probably throw their case out because I don't believe in incorporation doctrine. But that's an arcane legal discussion that we don't really need to get into here. So back to the point about the NRA being domestic terrorists. Does San Francisco really have a case? I don't think so, because a terrorist, by standard definition, is somebody who uses violence to achieve their political ends, which is a very broad term that can really encompass anyone. And there are lots and lots of groups in the world that can be considered terrorists. It's just we normally only apply the term terrorist to groups we don't like, because there are lots of groups in the world that use violence to achieve political ends. Most of them are called governments. Others are called freedom fighters or moderate rebels. Pretty much any group that's engaged in warfare or that is, engaged in arresting people. You could even go down and say your local police, your local police station is a domestic terrorist organization. You could say the sheriff's office is a domestic terrorist organization. You can make that case, and in all cases, it would be stronger than the case that San Francisco has made against the National Rifle Association. Because not only has the NRA never engaged, to my knowledge, in acts of violence for political purposes. I don't know of any acts of violence that they've engaged in, aggressive or even defensive. Now, in terms of what they advocate, sure, they advocate people to engage in self-defense, and they say, hey, if somebody attacks you, you have a right to to shoot that person. But that's not terrorism. That's not even advocating terrorism. Because terrorism can't be defensive. Terrorism is, by definition, offensive. I mean, that's why I said you can make the case that your local sheriff is a terrorist organization because, hey, if the sheriff deputy, if he comes in and he arrests you for, say, carrying around a bag of weed, well, I mean, you could make the case that that's certainly terrorism because what's the political goal that he's trying to achieve? Well, it's to get people to stop smoking weed, and, he's using violence to achieve that goal. So that's kind of terrorism. Whether you support that or not, of course, will determine whether you actually call it terrorism, But it's also, they're also not entirely terrorists because if you steal somebody's car and the cop comes and arrests you, he's acting in defense of the person that you stole from. So, there's gray areas here. But when it comes to the NRA, there are no gray areas. They simply have not even advocated for aggressive violence against anyone. And if there is an example, please do leave a comment, and I will, and I'll review it. But I've never seen, from as far as I'm concerned, I think the NRA is way too tame. And that's why I think everyone should join, Gun Owners of America, not the National Rifle Association. But with that said, I wish the NRA luck on their lawsuit, and I think it will be very funny to see if they end up winning, and I think they have a decent shot at winning. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you haven't already, please do share this video, because that is really the only way that it gets around. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.